Prerna Shandil, and I've been joined by journalist Arjun Singh to talk all about the upcoming elections and the politics around it. Welcome, Arjun.
Hello, Prerna. Thank you for having me.
Now, Arjun, you have been on ground throughout this election season. You've covered most of the campaign rallies of both the candidates. What is the ground pulse at this point?
Right now, I'd say that Donald Trump is definitely winning the election on the ground as well as in the polls. If you look at the polls, he is ahead across most swing state polls on average by a small margin, but still he's ahead. And these are polls historically that have always overestimated the Democratic vote in both 2016 and 2020. When you look at the results, the polling results before the election and the final results of the election, there was a huge discrepancy in favor of Democrats. So to see Donald Trump ahead in those polls this time around suggests that he not only has a slim lead, but perhaps his lead on the ground, given that overestimation that naturally occurs, is much greater. And as for what
Right.
voters are telling me, I've been all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the swing state with the largest number of electoral college votes. It has 19 votes, more than any other electoral college number for any state. And I've been talking to voters there about the issues that they're concerned about, what things are on their minds as they go to the polls, what they want to see from candidates. And I would say that the issues that voters are concerned about are much better for the Trump campaign than the Harris campaign. Because if you look at both campaigns, the Trump campaign's really been focusing a lot on the economy, on border security, and also on national security, foreign policy, specifically the wars in Ukraine and Israel. Whereas the Harris
Right.
campaign has been focusing more on the protection of democracy, suggesting that Donald Trump is a threat to it, and on abortion. When I talk to voters in swing states in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, most of them tell me that the concerns on their minds are the economy, on inflation, on taxation, and on border security. Only a small subset of people actually mention that abortion is the top priority for them. And even if they say that they're pro choice, there are many pro choice, pro abortion voters who are voting for Donald Trump because they just think that the economy is more important of an issue and border security is more important of an issue. And that leads me
Right.
to believe that the issue environment in the states, in the swing states, much more favors Donald Trump than it does Kamala Harris, which is why I think he's ahead right now on all across all metrics.
Right. So now talking about the swing states, I really want to break this down state-wise to understand the situation better. Now, talking about Michigan, which has a large Arab American population, and a lot of them, they're not happy with the Biden administration's handling of the Israel-Gaza war. Now, Harris is very much part of the administration, although she's not Biden. Do you think this population is going to support Harris at this point or Democrats?
The answer to that question is no. We are seeing a huge change in Michigan. This is really the pivot in the state of Michigan, the question of Gaza, the question of support for Israel's war in Gaza. And it has caused a very large number of Muslim American, Arab American voters to defect away from Kamala Harris. One of the most bizarre events of the 2024 campaign, I think, was happened very recently in a town called Hamtramck, Michigan, which is the only town in this municipality in America where the Muslim population is greater than 50%. It is a majority Muslim town, and it's led by a Democratic mayor, Amer Ghalib. This man, Amer Ghalib, recently endorsed Donald Trump for president of the United States. Just think of that. A Democratic Muslim mayor of the largest Muslim city in America endorsing Donald Trump, the Republican candidate who said various things about Muslims in the past, for president in the 2024 election. That's bizarre. And the only reason that's happening is because of the war in Gaza. Muslim American and Arab American voters think that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in general has betrayed them during this war in Gaza that started last year, because
Right.
they look at the United States support for Israel, they look at the military aid that's being provided to Israel to prosecute this war, and they see the number of civilian casualties, and they think that the Democratic Party is not listening to their concerns. They think that the Democratic Party supports the pro-Israeli position over the pro-Palestinian position, which is what they hold. And as a result, they're either not voting in the first place, they're going to sit this election out, or some of them are now voting for Donald Trump because they feel as though their vote is being taken taken for granted. And they want to show the Democratic Party that they are essential. Their support is essential to them to win Michigan so that in future elections, they're never discounted again. There's a huge protest vote that's happening in Michigan right now among Muslim and Arab Americans. And I think that's going to be the decisive question in terms of how the election occurs in Michigan. And it's if Donald Trump does end up winning the state and he's ahead in the polls right now over there, it'll be solely because of this reason. Not solely, actually. There are auto workers there as well, and electric vehicle mandates are relevant, but primarily because of this reason.
Right. So you're saying Israel-Gaza war is that one issue that has hurt, Harris campaign or Democrats in general a lot more than the other reasons, right?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily greater than all the other reasons. I mean, there are 4 years of Joe Biden's presidency and his records and his other achievements or failures to work on. That's what the campaign is really focused on trying to avoid. They're trying to distance themselves from Joe Biden right now, whereas Donald Trump's campaign is essentially presenting a contrast. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, comparing his 4 years to Biden's 4 years? That's the contrast that he's presenting. So there's a lot of policy to unpack from there. The situation in Israel is just one of them, but it is a very significant one because it's really fracturing the Democratic coalition, which is made up to a significant degree of young people as well as minority voters. Muslims being one of them, Arabs being another one of them, and college age students being a third group. These are groups
Right.
that where the Democratic turnout, where support for the Democratic Party has been severely hit by the Biden administration support for Israel, a US ally, during the war in Gaza. You have students on college campuses who are interrupting Kamala Harris and her running mate Tim Walz at rallies. They're obviously not going to vote for them based on what's going on. You have Muslim America, like I said, Amer Ghalib's endorsement of Donald Trump. You have Muslims across the country now voting for Trump or not sitting this one out. And in an election where the margins of victory are so slim, just like it was in 2016 and 2020, where the margins of victory are so slim in these battleground states, every vote counts. And if you have a sizable number of people who are part of your coalition traditionally, but are saying they won't vote for you now, that's a big problem. So I do think it's a
Right.
very significant issue.
Right. Now, talking about North Carolina and with the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and all the confusions and misinformation that followed it, where do you think these two candidates stand in terms of their popularity in North Carolina?
I'd say that the situation after Hurricane Helene it's been a tragedy, of course, and there's been a proactive response from the Biden administration as well as both campaigns to really capitalize on the political situation there. But I don't think it's going to really affect the outcome of the election over there. Donald Trump is ahead by a small margin. And I think most observers will look at North Carolina over the last two elections, 2016, 2020, and see that there is a significant Republican turnout that can be generated, which is why, personally, I think it's very likely that Donald Trump will win the state. Not because of Hurricane Helene. Even if that had not happened, he would still be on track to win the state right now. And that's
Right.
because, and I was in Asheville, North Carolina. I spoke to people who were affected by the tragedy in Western North Carolina, and they told me that based on what happened in North Carolina, the flooding, the hurricane, the destruction, the death, it's still not going to affect the way they vote because there are just other elections that are going, the other issues in the election that are overwhelming that decision. Now, as
Right.
for, the conduct of the election, it may not be possible for many of these people to vote, unfortunately, because they have so many other things going on in their lives right now. But all that's to say is I don't think the hurricane is going to really change the ground game in North Carolina all that much.
Right. Now, talking about Pennsylvania, you mentioned this earlier a little bit that this is that one state where both the candidates have spent most amount of their time and resources. What do you think? Do you think, like last week, we saw Donald Trump, at McDonald's working, giving out fries. Do you think that worked its magic? And also talking about the population of Latino and Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, where do you think these two candidates stand now?
Well, when you ask me about where they stand now, we're speaking after Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden on
Yes.
Sunday, where there was a speaker who made disparaging remarks about Puerto Ricans, allegedly as
Yes.
a joke, but it's caused a lot of problems with the community, and they're very angry about it. I'm not sure that one remark is necessarily going to change anyone's intentions on how they chose to vote. Less than just over a week before election day. It's October 28th when we're speaking. Election day is on November 5th, so the Tuesday after next Tuesday. I think at this point, most people in the community have made up their minds, and that this is just one controversial remark which will enter the news cycle and be quickly forgotten, like so many other controversial things and moments in American politics over the last several months and frankly years. It's just something
But
that we're numb to right now. But as for Pennsylvania and as for Donald Trump's photo opportunity at McDonald's recently, where he went and made fries and served people at the drive-through counter, I think that's a good photo op. I think that's the general consensus among the American political class and observers, that it showed him as being a real person, someone who's in touch with these, populist and everyday facets of life. People don't necessarily listen to politics, but they definitely, if they live in the suburbs, for instance, have the experience of going to a drive-through, getting food, and essentially sort of having fast food, that whole experience. And the fact that Trump was able to insert himself into that and show that he's capable of doing something like that really makes him very relatable. It's not something that the Harris campaign has done, and I don't think they can do it now, because if they essentially try to recreate what Donald Trump has done so as to match up to him, it'll look like they're playing catch up, which is not going to happen.
right.
But as for
Mhm.
Pennsylvania as a whole, I would say that the fact that both campaigns are really investing a lot of resources over there to generate turnout and convince more supporters. One thing that must be remembered about Pennsylvania, like many of the other swing states, is that the turnout in the cities of Pennsylvania, specifically Pittsburgh and Philadelphia on the west and the east, respectively, is very, very powerful for Democrats. Traditionally, if Democrats are able to generate enough turnout in those two cities and their suburbs, in Allegheny County, in Chester County, Bucks County, Montgomery County, these suburban counties of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, they're able to win the state. To quote the American political strategist James Carville, who masterminded Bill Clinton's successful campaign in 1992, Pennsylvania is essentially Pittsburgh on one end, Philadelphia on the other, and Alabama in the middle. It's a very progressive sort of a state with very progressive wings and a very conservative heartland. Trump is looking for that conservative heartland. He's trying to get them to turn out as much as possible. But if Harris is able to turn out the people in those two areas, I think it'll be a very, very close victory for her if she can do that.
Right. So, now, Arjun, what do you think of these other states like Nevada, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona? Is there any indication which candidate is ahead in these states?
There are clear indications, and in the southern states and western states, specifically Georgia and Arizona, I'd say that Donald Trump is ahead in those states without question, and he is on track to win those states right now. This could change before election day. There's still 8 days to go. But the fact that the crisis at the border has been such a strong focus of Donald Trump's campaign this time around, illegal immigration, illegal border crossings, the resultant effects from that. In a border state like Arizona, that is extremely powerful. You have many, many people having crossed the border, US border with Mexico illegally into Arizona. The Tucson sector of the border specifically has received a huge number of illegal migrants, and that's had resultant effects on the communities over there, which has the effect of pushing the state more towards Donald Trump because he's talking about closing the border, deporting all of those illegal immigrants, etc. In Georgia, it's a similar situation, but because it's not a border state, Trump's message on the economy is particularly strong over there. I visited Georgia a couple of times during the election, and I spoke with voters, and they suggested that inflation being a big problem and the state of employment being a significant problem and Trump's promises on taxation, that really affects people who are living in suburban Atlanta, metro Atlanta, which is really where the election in Georgia will be won or lost. In 2020, Joe Biden was able to generate enough turnout and, in fact, flip a lot of Republican voters in the suburbs of Atlanta who traditionally always vote Republican, which is why it used to be a very clearly red state, but were somewhat dismayed by Trump, his performance, his character. you now see those voters actually moving back towards Trump because they look at the policy record of the Biden administration and they're dissatisfied with it, which is why they're now moving back towards traditionally voting for Republicans. So it's pretty clear that Donald Trump is ahead in Georgia right now, and the polls, I think, suggest that too. As for Nevada, that's a more interesting state because it never wasn't always a swing state. In 2020 it started to become more competitive, and that's because of the whole service sector that's in Nevada. Las Vegas is a huge entertainment resort tourism destination. There are lots of service workers who work in the fast food industry, in catering, in personal services, etc. And those workers have been particularly hurt by economic conditions right now, low wages, low productivity, etc. And when Donald Trump talks about removing actually no taxes, removing taxes on tips, removing taxes on several other things, that's a very powerful message to those service industry workers in Nevada. And he has also been quite proactive about reaching out to unions this time around, organized labor, which perhaps some say is a lot more conservative than professional labor that exists that lives in the big cities. That's really where the dynamics in Nevada are working out, which is one side of the story. The other side of the story are social issues in Nevada, and we're seeing somewhat of a shift on the ground there in terms of what people think about these various social issues like transgender ideology, like the crisis at the border, for instance. When it comes to Nevada in particular, the University of Nevada at Reno's women's volleyball team is actually making a significant contribution to the election in that their refusal to play against a team with a biological man from San Jose State University has really made transgender ideology and men and women's sports, as the Republicans put it, a big flashpoint in the election in Nevada. And you have Republican candidates now capitalizing on that. As well, Nevada is not on the border, but it's close to the border. And so the border crisis affects them too. So I'd say that the dynamics in Nevada are quite heterogeneous right now, but unlike previous years, Trump is way more competitive in Nevada than he was ever before.
Right. Now, talking about populations and all these states, you have spent a lot of time in India. And do you think, have you ever spoken to Indian diaspora while you were, while you were covering the campaigns? Where do they stand in terms of their support for either of the candidates?
Absolutely. I have spoken with lots of either Indians who immigrated to the United States and are now naturalized US citizens, as well as their children, Americans who are of Indian origin. I've asked them how their identity as Indians interacts with their decision on whom to vote. And I've gotten some very interesting responses. There hasn't really been a clear trend, but what's interesting is that the election, just like many other demographics in America, has really divided the Indian American community because you have, on one hand, a lot of people who support Kamala Harris. They want to see the first Indian American become the president of the United States of America. That symbolically is very attractive to them. But on the other hand, you have lots of Indian Americans who are not happy with Kamala Harris, not happy with Joe Biden. And as a result, they're voting for Donald Trump. Apparently, this whole notion of identitarian visibility, of seeing an Indian American president, just isn't that persuasive to them. And they're more concerned about policy issues. For instance, recently on Saturday, I was in State College, Pennsylvania for one of Donald Trump's campaign rallies over there. I was there to cover the election, to talk to voters, etc. And I spoke with a lady named Shivani Cole. She is a 22-year-old Indian American, US born person from Colorado, going to school in Pennsylvania. And she told me that while she is a young Indian American woman, while she is very, very much pro abortion, she's leaning towards voting for Donald Trump. Why? Because of the economy, because of inflation, because of housing. She wants to own a home later on, and housing prices have gone up. You see these fissures. That's just an interesting flash. That's just an interesting interpolation into the dynamics among Indian American voters. I think, on the whole, when one looks at exit poll statistics after the election, we'll see that by and large, Indian Americans have still voted for the Democratic candidate. in preponderance, over 50% of them. But you may see a significant shift towards the Republican Party because they're not just voting on the basis of their identity anymore. And frankly, even on the basis of their identity, the Republican Party has really changed the way it looks and speaks to different communities in recent years, and that's capturing some of their support as well. And it's not as if there weren't Indian Americans in Republican and conservative politics before. They always were. I mean, Bobby Jindal, for instance, was the governor of Louisiana back in the early 2000s. Nikki Haley was elected governor of South Carolina back in 2011. So they were always present, but now we're seeing them being more visible, I think, because there's been a lot more attention that's being directed to identity politics, for instance. Over the last decade or so in American politics, identity and racial identity has become a real locus of where you stand politically and what your views ought to be. And so people are now talking in those terms more. And as a result, those who are active in politics, their identities are a lot more visible, which is why you see more Indian Americans who are, Republicans. They always were Republicans. But that aside, one cannot deny the fact that seeing prominent Indian Americans in the Republican Party has definitely opened up a lot of questions and questioning by Indian Americans of where they should stand politically. You now have a lot of groups, organizations that are being formed by Indian Americans and Hindu Americans and Sikh Americans to support different candidates. For instance, there's a group called the Republican Hindu Coalition, which has been very active in fundraising for Trump's campaigns, supporting Republican candidates across the country. You have a group called Sikhs for Trump in New Jersey, where there's a huge Sikh population that's now supporting Donald Trump. So this is perhaps prompting more political activity from people whose views were pretty constant beforehand. But the fact that they are more active and they're more visible means that Indian Americans are playing a greater role in politics on both sides of the aisle. And that's a new and interesting development.
Right. Now, Arjun, only last week, pollster Nate Silver came out and said that this is a 50-50, competition, and both the candidates have equal amount of chances in terms of winning this election. Although he said that his gut says that Donald Trump is ahead of Harris, but then he also said that not to believe his gut. So, do you think this is, a margin of error contest?
Well, I think that's pretty clear from what the polls suggest right now. If Donald Trump's lead in certain states is within the margin of error, or Kamala Harris's lead is within the margin of error, that absolutely makes it a margin of error contest, which is why in these battleground states, you see both candidates spending all of their time over there. And nowadays, they're not even talking about the issues as much. They are still talking about the issues, obviously, but not to the same degree as they did before. Now the campaign is shifting into its final stage where during their rallies, both of them are talking about one issue above all else, and that is getting out the vote. GOTV, get out the vote efforts are critical to both candidates right now. They want to generate they want to bring as many of their supporters to the polls. So they are speaking in those terms to voters. They are telling them during their rallies, here are the instructions, here are the dates. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, they're not, I mean, at that level, when you're in American politics, you don't really focus on these minutiae details as much, but they are spelling out those details for voters in their speeches, telling them where to go, when to do it, what time, what date. They are trying to drill into voters' heads that you must get to the polls. You must vote early if you can, but you must, if you're not going to vote early, at the very least, make a plan to vote so that on election day you can go. They get them to the polls, they cast their ballot. It's all about turnout in these states, and as a result, that's what's going to sort of determine who wins these critical states where the polling suggests they're in the margin of error. The polls only capture a snapshot of the electorate, of people who are not only likely to vote, but also have enough time to respond to these polls in the first place. That somewhat is sort of microcosm of the larger section of people who actually will vote and was not sure where exactly they will stand, which is why turnout is so crucial. So that's really where this election is going right now.
Right. So surely it looks like neck and neck competition between both the candidates. We'll have to wait and watch. Thank you so much, Arjun, for joining me.
Thank you, Prerna.